Korean War broke out 70 years ago, with ramifications still felt to this day, where the Korean Peninsula remains divided and, at times, confrontational. Despite moments of optimism, U.S. sanctions against Pyongyang continue, and tensions have increased recently between the South and the North. So what is causing the latest deterioration, and what are the keys that could unlock the stalemate? And how should the roles of China and the U.S. be evaluated? To talk about these issues and more, I'm joined by Yang Xuyu, Senior Fellow of the China Institute of International Studies, Sung-Yoon Lee, a Kim Korea Foundation Professor of Korean Studies at Fletcher School of Tufts University, and Peter Kuznick, Professor of History and Director of the Nuclear Studies Institute, American University in Washington. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. Mr. Lee, let me start with you. 25th this year marks the 70th anniversary of the start of the Korean War. And also this month marks the signature of the Panmunjom Declaration between Seoul and Pyongyang. So how would you evaluate the situation on the Korean Peninsula over the past 7 decades and where we are now?
Well, if you look at the 7 decades or so leading up to the outbreak of the war in 1950, there are at least 4 major wars. Back then, of course, Japan was the primary principal imperialist power, waging war against China in 1894 over control of Korea and Manchuria, and then a decade later against Russia, and colonizing Korea and resuming its war against China later on. So things were very unstable. The region was a quagmire for the 60-70-year period leading up to 1950, whereas over the past 7 decades, it's been a shaky, imperfect, at times dangerous peace, but de facto peace, no war in or around the Korean Peninsula. So I think historians will mark that it's been a period of relative prosperity, peace, and stability, during which time South Korea has risen as a model democracy, in nation building, a prosperous country. So there's much success, bright side of history there, whereas of course North Korea has gone the other way and poses a threat to the region.
And probably that fracture is the reasons for people to worry. And Mr. Kuznick, how fragile is the peace on the Korean Peninsula now?
It's definitely fragile, but it's stronger today than it was yesterday or 2 days ago, and it's much stronger than it was in late 2017. In 2017, North Korea was conducting its missile tests, its nuclear weapons tests, at least intercontinental ballistic missiles tests, and the leaders on both sides were hurling insults. The United States, Trump was calling Kim Jong-un a little rocket man. He was referring to Trump as a dotard, and they were just insulting each other. It got so bad in 2017 that many experts thought we were heading for war. The head of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, thought there was a 50-50 chance that we were going for war. Both sides were gearing up, so now, compared to then, is much more peaceful, much more stable. But it's still not the kind of ideal situation that we'd like to see.
But what do you think happened make us walk away from the brink of the war in 2018 and 19? Is it because of the diplomacy from both sides of the United States and the DPRK, or the South Korean China's diplomatic moves?
I think it was a combination of factors. On the one hand, Moon Jae-in took the initiative when Moon took office after the Sunshine Revolution there. That was a very positive development. There were a lot of people in the United States who put pressure on Trump to back off of his threats. Chinese diplomacy was very instrumental in this regard. And the reality is that nobody wanted a war, because a war on the Korean Peninsula would have been horrific in its consequences. Even if North Korea did not use its nuclear weapons, even with its conventional weapons, it could have wreaked such havoc, caused so much death, then there would have been a retaliation by South Korea and the United States. It would have been the worst thing we've seen, certainly since the Vietnam War, and possibly worse than that.
And Mr. Lee, the question is, how long will the peace last? And is it just a calm before another big storm? Because DPRK several days ago demolished the liaison office, the only link connecting the North and South. But once again, DPRK suspended what they call military action plan against the South recently during a Central Military Commission meeting. What happened in the North?
Well, in the days leading up to North Korea's massive, well-calculated invasion of the South on June 25th, 70 years ago today, North Korea proposed to South Korea, for example, on June 7th, and then again on June 19th, just 6 days before the invasion, a proposal for talks to set up a joint inter-Korean parliament in Pyongyang, and to have that launch on August 15th, on the 5th anniversary of liberation from Japanese colonialism. North Korea is very shrewd, it's very clever, and knows how to use both the stick and carrot. So Kim Jong-un coming out and saying that he is suspending the plan to take military action against South Korea is noteworthy, yes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that North Korea is entirely changing course and suing for peace.
But does DPRK understand this is a tall order for ROK, something that South Koreans simply couldn't do without the approval from Washington?
Well, Washington is concerned primarily of becoming entangled in another war in the Korean Peninsula. We know South Korea and the US really don't want that. We know North Korea and China don't want that either. But this is where Kim Jong-un and his predecessors, father and grandfather, are very calculating. They seize upon that vulnerability of bigger, richer states having a lower threshold for pain and war, and use that, play on those fears to sometimes act crazy, quote unquote, sometimes act unstable, and then when Kim Jong-un dramatically changes the tune and beaming smile says, let's talk, most of the time his adversaries take the bait. So we are seeing a welcome lull in North Korea's provocations, but those provocations are coming back.
And Mr. Kuznick, do you also think that the DPRK has actually been very smart playing a game between major powers? And what is the plan for 2020?
Well, the DPRK is smart in a sense, but probably dumb overall. The situation in the North is not good right now. The economy is suffering badly from what we know, partly because they've shut down the borders. They've basically cut off some of the economic relations that they had with China that were so instrumental for their economic well-being. The situation was not good then, and it has gotten worse. They've done this because of their fear of COVID spreading in the country, and that's a serious problem.
We don't know that for sure. We don't know that for sure, do we?
We don't know a lot for sure about what's happening. The reports coming out of North Korea about the health situation are all fairly rosy. But we know that the health system is not strong. If there was a serious outbreak of COVID-19 inside North Korea, that would be a very, very serious problem. So they've taken steps to safeguard against that, which is a good thing. But their overall economic situation is not strong right now. And we'll talk about the wisdom of their policies. They're very, very isolated. They have few cards to play in this situation. They're very dependent on China, both economically and diplomatically. And right now, China and the United States are on the verge of a new Cold War. So China's interests at this point also in some ways diverge from American interest. So it's a very complicated situation, and it's good that Kim backed down from the threats that he was making, because that was not going to achieve anything. As the other guests were saying, President Moon's options right now are fairly limited, and he is not able to deliver what North Korea would like to see.
All right. We'll talk about China's role and the United States' role here in the South Korean-North Korean relations. We'll be right back after this. And to talk about the 70th anniversary of the Korean War, we have Mr. Yang Xiyu. He's a senior fellow from the China Institute of International Studies here in the studio. Mr. Yang, Mr. Kuznick just mentioned you can say it's Cold War or divergent paths of China and the United States. What is the effect on that, on the Korean Peninsula situation?
Well, I agree with this sentiment. Yes, Sino-US relations really is at the brink of a Cold War. But remember, when we talk about the lesson of the Korean War, China suffered a lot. If there was no Cold War, there won't be such a terrible Korean War. So now, China's policy regarding to North Korean nuclear issue and the policy towards the U.S. is a sort of, linkage. Say, no matter how bad the U.S.-China relation is, China's policy towards denuclearization remain unchanged. We are very firm on the denuclearization, regardless of the good shape or bad shape of the U.S.-China relation. Just look at the past 2 decades. U.S.-China relation, has been in fluctuation, good, bad, good, bad. But in terms of the cooperation between China and the U.S. on the nuclear issue on the peninsula, it's stable.
But people might ask, with the deterioration of relations between China and the U.S., does China have more incentives or less incentives to apply pressure on Pyongyang?
Well, the answer should be mixed. Even when we have a good relation with the U.S., we also keep pushing pressures on North Korea, plus the so-called incentives. Now the tactics and the policy remain unchanged. Say, on one hand, we have been calling for the necessary, reasonable, humanitarian-based assistances to North Korea. That's incentives, we can say. But on the other hand, we have keep insisting on the sanctions. We take most of the responsibility also on sanctions on North Korea. And even during the bad shape of U.S.-China relation, we have any tiny change of the policy of a sanction on North Korea. So basically, we keep working on 2 hands, incentives and pressures, so that we can, for negotiation, for restoration of negotiation. Yeah.
You talk about sanctions. Of course, sanctions is very harmful to DPRK economy and probably also social stability. And also the impact of COVID-19, a double whammy. What kind of what shape is the DPRK now is in?
Well, because of the little information out of North Korea, all we can analyze can based on basically guess. No matter you are Chinese, you are American or South Korean, most of the analysis based on guesses. So basically, I think on one hand, their health system in the country was very weak. But on the other hand, in terms of social distancing, I think they performed the best. For prevent COVID-19 from spreading, the simplest, the fundamental measure is a social distancing. So in this regard, they are working well. But
what about their economy? Is they're hanging there, or is suffering a huge
I think the COVID-19 will certainly damage the economy, just damaging on Chinese economy, American economy, and the South Korean economy. But I think they have one more negative affecting impacts. That is the cut off almost all normal trade between China and North Korea. That is the single pillar now for the external resources, plus some illegal activities. So basically, their economy has been suffering more and more from the pandemic. That also caused more and more humanitarian problems inside North Korea.
And Mr. Lee, do you think the dilemma that the DPRK is now in provided more reasons for it to be more willing to talk to the South and ask the South to break away from the United States and reach out to the North?
Yes, that's the central dilemma, the existential question of how to deal with South Korea and its main supporter, the United States. You see, the dilemma stems from the fact that South Korea, that other Korean state, is at least 30, probably 50 times richer than North Korea. It draws the North Korean people. It's a magnet for the North Korean people. There are over 33,000 North Korean escapees who have resettled in South Korea. So how do you deal with an existential threat, even as warm as South Korea is toward Pyongyang under the current Moon administration? If you completely behave, then you won't get any respect. You have to be a political factor for North Korea. And this is a dilemma that neither China nor Vietnam experienced when the two countries took reform measures for China in the late 70s and early 1980s, and for Vietnam in the mid-80s, when there was no South Vietnam to speak of. So this systemic contest for pan-Korean legitimacy still weighs heavily over the DPRK.
But what kind of economic cooperation can the two sides achieve without breaking the protocols that is agreed upon between South Korea and the United States?
Unfortunately, at this point, not much, unless the UN Security Council resolutions are lifted. So in 2016 and 2017, as we know, the United Nations implemented resolute, really firm sanctions against North Korea for the first time in history, and those are on the books now. So joint ventures linking the railway between the North and South, South Korea re-engaging North Korean laborers in the Kaesong industrial complex, having tourists visit North Korea on a regular basis. All these are sensitive topics that technically are prohibited under those UN Security Council resolutions. So there's not all that much that South Korea can do, but North Korea is demanding on the South to do more.
So lifting the sanctions, Mr. Kuznick, probably pretty much depended on what the U.S. is planning to do with the DPRK. But as you just mentioned, the 2018 and 19 talks, although resulted in relative peace on the Korean Peninsula, it didn't bring substantial results, for example, denuclearization or the lifting of sanctions.
Yes, that was the frustration. In the Hanoi summit in February of 2019, the talks broke down. The North was looking for the U.S. lifting of sanctions. They desperately needed sanctions relief. And Trump was demanding that North Korea act first in terms of denuclearizing the peninsula. And neither side would budge. The talks ended early. They did not have a joint resolution. And since that point, conditions have worsened. Most recently, Kim Yo-jong, who is Kim Jong-un's sister, has been publicly criticizing very, very harshly Moon Jae-in. She's called him insane. She's called him servile. She's tried to put pressure on South Korea to break with the United States and come across with much more economic aid and improved relations with the North outside of the agreements and the relationship
But
between
as
the United
Mr. Lee
States and South
mentioned,
Korea.
that's simply impossible for the South to do that.
It's impossible for the South to do that if it wants to retain its relationship with the United States. On the other hand, you've got Trump, who's also been making threats toward South Korea. Trump, over the years, has been talked about pulling U.S. troops or cutting back U.S. troops in South Korea, having the South Koreans pay substantially more money for the U.S. troops who are there. So there's not the relation between the United States and South Korea have also not been that smooth. Trump criticized Moon Jae-in for reaching out to North Korea back in 2017 and 2018 before Trump reversed itself. But you have to put this all in the context of the re-election, of the election coming up in the United States. And the fact that Trump is doing so poorly. The recent polling has him anywhere between 8 and 14% behind Joe Biden. Trump is pretty desperate for a foreign policy victory. If you look at Trump's foreign policy record, he really has nothing to run on, nothing to brag about, no real successes. And the one thing he clung to was his easing relations with North Korea, pulling back from the brink of war. He asked Prime Minister Abe to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize. To most of the world, that was a joke, but Trump was serious about this. So that was what he was counting on. And now, as his situation becomes more desperate in the United States, he's lashing out. That's why he was attacking China over Trump's terrible performance when it came to the coronavirus. And he needs scapegoats. He needs people to blame because his own performance has been so dismal, and the American people are waking up to that fact.
And Ms. Liang, do you think DPRK is also calculating, because it's election year in the United States, and the DPRK can place a wedge between South Korea and the United States, and maybe drawing South even closer to it?
Well, yes, actually, North Korea has been trying to have a wedge between the U.S. and DPRK, U.S. and ROK for a long time. For this time, based on landslide victory of the ruling parties in the parliamentary in South Korea, they hoped, they expect President Moon could do something. Let me talk about this way.
Because it's unrealistic to make anything happen this year between United States and DPRK.
No, yeah, actually, they want to make some improvement of the economic cooperation between North and South by South Korea doing something of relaxing of the sanctions. Let me put it about this way. All sanction measures composed by multilateral, led by UN, and unilateral, conducted by
the United States,
U.S., ROK, and so on. At least they hoped Moon can do something in the unilateral way, but nothing, so they go the other way. And that's the dilemma for North Korea. Many people say North Korea should go follow Chinese and Vietnamese, but on the other hand, they have no condition from Chinese and the Vietnamese because of the sanction. They want to open up, but they cannot open up because of sanction. So they desperately want the sanction relief. So that's the dilemma facing North Korea. So let's go, hey, you should lift in sanction, and the U.S. say, how about nuclear? So another dilemma comes here.
So we come to the old stalemate that has been lasting for decades.
Yeah.
It seems there is no solution on the horizon whatsoever can solve this.
I have
because we've tried everything.
Yeah. You're right. Actually, that's been decades-long deadlock about the chicken and the egg.
Yeah.
Who should come first? So now the key lies in the mutual confidence, or CBMs.
Which is deeply lacking between the two sides.
Yeah. Now that is the root of the current complex deadlocks on the Korean Peninsula issues. But basically, I think restoration of the talks between the two sides and the related other parties is the path to find the key to unlock the multiple dilemmas so that we can move on the denuclearization and permanent peace through the peaceful manner.
So, Mr. Lee, what do you think President Moon is thinking about the moment? Because obviously he's also facing political pressure domestically and pressure from the United States, and he knows what the North wants, what he's going to do.
Well, I'm unable to divine what President Moon is thinking himself, but I do know that whenever the South Korean government reaches out to North Korea and North Korea responds positively, whenever there is the mood created of inter-Korean reconciliation, the leaders, the South Korean leaders' approval ratings go up, the South Korean public support that kind of engagement. So that's what President Moon desperately wants, of course. And it's perverse reality, but a reality that common problems, common threats bring even adversaries together, as the common threat of the Soviet Union brought China and the United States together, conducting secret talks starting in 1969, leading to Nixon's visit to China in 1972. So the North Korea problem, somewhat ironically, presents opportunities for the United States and China to, if not completely mend fences, then tone things down and try to cooperate on a host of issues of mutual benefit.
But Mr. Kuznick, is America, I don't think anything will happen this year, but probably after the election, will American leaders think of something different?
We don't know the answer to that. Joe Biden, overall, has been pretty much of a hawk on foreign policy. Joe Biden has actually criticized Trump for not being strong enough when it comes to China. And so many of us have tried to put pressure on Biden and the people around him to take a different kind of approach toward relations with China. And hopefully we will see that. But right now I'm not very optimistic based upon Biden's track record or his recent statements. There are some advisors around him who are much more peace-minded, I would say, and hopefully they will prevail, and the United States will have a different relationship with both China and with North Korea.
All right.
But I agree that while Trump is in office, we're not likely to see much more progress.
Thank you very much. Hopefully something will happen down the road. Thank you, Mr. Kuznick. Thank you, Mr. Lee. And thank you, Mr. Yang. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.